Ambassador Bolton, welcome back to Planet America.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
What have you made of President Trump's behaviour since the election? Falsely claiming victory and to have had the election stolen from him, and then, of course, inciting the riots against the Capitol.
Well, it's been disgraceful, really, is the only way to describe it. I think it's caused considerable harm both to the country and certainly to the Republican Party in denying what became increasingly obvious, that he had lost the election. He and his campaign had many opportunities to prove his allegations of systematic fraud, that the election had been stolen, a lot of variations on that. He struck out in every state administrative proceeding, every court case that he brought, and yet he persisted that he had won the election really by a landslide. I think that had a very unfortunate effect on many of his supporters. I think the Republican leadership did not do an adequate job in refuting these claims, so that in the minds of many people, they heard the president say it, they didn't hear anybody contradict him, or at least they didn't hear any Republicans contradict him, and they came to believe it. And it just got worse and worse, leading to the decision that the president would try to block congressional certification of the Electoral College vote on January the 6th. And that in turn led to the president really being responsible for this mob that invaded the Capitol grounds in an effort to prevent the certification from taking place. So the whole thing was a sad exercise for the United States. I think it has caused us damage internationally. It's caused us damage here at home. I think all that can be fixed, but it's unfortunately typical Donald Trump. It's all about him. It's not about the country. It's not about reality. It's on what benefits Donald Trump, and that's it.
Did you see all of that as Trump just being a sore loser, just a fiction to try and save face from a wounded ego? Or was it something more sinister than that? Was this an attack on American democracy?
Well, I think from Trump's point of view, he can't tell the difference between right and wrong. It's, as I say, if you measure everything by whether it benefits Donald Trump, conventional standards of law and morality really don't play into that. But I've also said, and I believe, that Trump is not smart enough to be a successful authoritarian. And I think the lesson we draw is that he stressed the constitutional system, but that the system held firm and resisted his efforts. And so in that sense, I think it's a lesson for all of us that, as Ronald Reagan said, freedom is never safe more than one generation. Every generation has to watch out for it. And Trump, although he's an aberration in American politics, in disguise gave us a blessing, because we saw what might happen if somebody who had more true authoritarian instincts had been making this effort. There are things we can correct and strengthen.
And what is your view of his second impeachment and the prospect of a Senate trial, possible conviction, and even disqualifying from running for president again?
Well, my own view, and I've studied this pretty carefully, is I don't think the Constitution permits a Senate trial once the president has left office. I won't get into an extended discussion of the constitutional text and structure. That's probably, my view is probably a minority point of view, but I think it's certainly going to be one of the issues that the Senate discusses. I think, as I say, I think the conduct on January the 6th was unacceptable, probably does amount to an impeachable offense, but I think we all have to ask the prudential question: is the country better off going through an impeachment and trial than not, and allowing Trump to be prosecuted possibly for criminal violations? In terms of the impeachment process, I think the question is, if you really want to hurt Donald Trump, if you want to do the most possible damage to him, the thing to do is ignore him and not try him for impeachment.
If he's not convicted by the Senate or a future court, do you expect Donald Trump will try and stage a return to the White House?
Well, I think he wants to remain the center of attention. I think that's certainly true. I think he's in politics not for philosophy or policy, but for the adulation. So I think he will talk about running in 2024 constantly. It's a good way to raise money. Look, this impeachment trial in the Senate will be a good way to raise money for him. But when it comes down to it, I don't think he will actually run in 2024 because I don't think he wants to risk losing a second time.
Hearing your pretty damning assessment of Donald Trump in recent times, a lot of us have been a little concerned that this guy is banned from Twitter and yet he still has the nuclear codes. He could launch an attack at any moment. Should we have been concerned that this guy had the nuclear football?
Well, he doesn't have it, actually. A military aide has the nuclear football. It's contrary to what some Hollywood producers think happens. It's not just a question of taking the card out of his pocket and dialing up the strategic command and saying launch. It's considerably more complicated than that. No, I never really felt there was that kind of danger. I do think that Trump doesn't pay much attention to norms or conventions, and I think the decisions he's making on extensive pardons at the end of his administration really take that beyond any normal presidential desire to wrap up unfinished business at the end of the term. But that's really to exaggerate the danger beyond what we already saw, I think makes it harder to explain why Trump was a problem. If you get too far removed in the criticism, it gets to the point where people don't believe the threat is real. I think the damage he did was real. You don't need to exaggerate it. It was bad enough. Now the task is to correct it.
John Bolton, now that we're at the end of the Trump era, how would you characterise his presidency? What is his legacy?
Well, in America, we have a game of rating the presidents, who's the best president, who's the worst president. So Trump was the 45th president. The current holder of the worst president title in virtually every survey I've seen is James Buchanan, who presided over the dissolution of the Union in 1860 and 1861. But it's pretty hard to get worse than that. I think Trump's the man to give him a run for his money, though.
Explain to us why you give him such historically low marks. His defenders, those that remain, point to the fact that he did preside over a very strong economy until the pandemic came along. Things were going pretty well for a time there. You agreed with a lot of his foreign policy positions as well.
Yes, that's correct. I don't attribute that to any philosophical consistency on Trump's part. I attribute it purely to political calculations. But I think although he's not the sole cause of excessive partisanship in the United States, he's made it much worse. He's an arch proponent of the politics of personal destruction. I think that's bad in any democracy. And I think the risk of what would happen in a second Trump term if he had won was fully demonstrated during the past year in his utter mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic, where beginning in January of 2020, he said it's not a threat, it's under control, it's going to go away, it didn't come from China, it's not going to threaten the economy, it'll go away magically in the spring. Why don't we consider injecting bleach into people to get rid of the virus? I mean, it just went from bad to worse. And efforts to have a coherent, government-wide strategic approach that might have mitigated the severity of the impact of the disease in the United States fell completely apart time and time again. It's not that elements of the government didn't try to do their job. It was that there was no leadership from the top. And I think he will be remembered from that as the historical record comes out. We're now about to pass 400,000 dead Americans. That's a pretty terrible outcome.
Finally, John Bolton, you've suggested that the greater danger is that somebody like Trump comes along, but they're smarter than Trump. How do you stop, either as a party or a nation, somebody who is unfit and dangerous as president from taking office again?
Well, I think we didn't stop Donald Trump because simply nobody thought it was possible. Nobody thought it was possible. He defeated 16 Republican challengers and then beat Hillary Clinton, which nobody thought was going to happen in 2016. There was a book written during the 1930s when fascism was on the march in Europe about America called It Can't Happen Here. And yet the outcome of the book was that it did happen in America. So I think, I'll just speak for the Republican Party, I think we have to do two things to minimize the chance it can happen again. Number one, and most important, we should return to a Reaganite approach to our view of the world. We should look for somebody with a coherent philosophy that's conservative and that's optimistic and forward-looking like Reagan's. And number two, something that's may sound a bit old-fashioned, but I think we have to examine potential candidates for character. Donald Trump had no character. And so judging people by their philosophy and by their character, I think is the best means to prevent another Trump from doing more damage in the future.
John Bolton, thank you for being with us on Planet America.
Well, thanks for having me.